What Nature Abhors by Mark Morris. When Meacher opened his eyes, the train was empty. Though he'd thought it was the jolt of the brakes that had woken him. He stood up, the low-level anxiety of disorientation already beginning to grind in his belly. The carriage was old and grimy, and smelled musty, as if each threadbare seat had absorbed too much sweat over too many years. The upholstery and stained carpet were predominantly grey, with overlapping flecks in 2 shades of bilious green that jittered like TV interference on the periphery of his vision. Outside the window, the stone walls of the station building looked smoke-blackened, except for pale oblongs where the station's nameplates had been removed, probably by vandals. As far as Meacher could see, it was not only the train that was deserted, but the platform too, and so profoundly, it seemed to him, that he suppressed his urge to call out, oddly fearful of how intrusive, or worse, insignificant, his voice might sound in the enveloping silence. Stepping into the aisle, he automatically reached towards the luggage rack above his head, but found it empty. Had he had a bag, or even a jacket, at the outset of his journey? It would have been unusual for him to have travelled with neither, but his brain felt so dulled by fatigue that he honestly couldn't remember. He sat down again, intimidated by solitude and by his own aberrant memory. He had a notion that the merest glimpse of a guard or another passenger, or perhaps even the incomprehensible blare of a station announcer's voice, would be all that he would need to restore his sense of himself and his surroundings. However, when he realised 10 minutes later that he was actually holding his breath in anticipation of a hint of life beside his own, he decided he could be passive no longer. He stood up with a decisiveness that was for no one's benefit but his, and lurched along the length of the carriage, his arms pumping like a cross-country skier's as he yanked at seats to maintain his momentum. Once on the platform, he paused only briefly, so that he would not have to consciously acknowledge the absence of life. The exit sign caused his spirits to flare with a disproportionate fierceness, if only because, albeit impersonal, it was a form of communication, and hinted at more to come. He stumped through the arch beneath the sign, and found himself in a ticket office, containing back-to-back rows of red metal seats, and an unmanned ticket window. From above this, too, a nameplate had been removed, and with such care that Meacher wondered whether the place was understaffed because it was on the verge of closure. The station was certainly small enough for this theory to be feasible, or at least appeared too inconsequential to have been granted a car park, because a further exit door led down a flight of stone steps and thence to what appeared to be a town centre side street. Even out here there was no indication of life, though Meacher felt optimistic that he would encounter some sooner rather than later. There were signs of human occupation, the stink of stale urine as he descended the steps, discarded confectionery wrappers and food cartons, emblazoned with comfortingly iconic logos: McDonald's, Kit Kat, KFC. On the far side of a pedestrian crossing, a chalked sign in a pub window promised big screen Sky Sports. Meacher might have ventured inside to freshen his dry mouth with something sweet and fizzy, if the pub's wooden doors, so hefty they put him in mind of a dungeon, had not been firmly shut. The pub's neighbours were equally inaccessible. Indeed, a grubby jeweller's shop and a shop that contained second-hand musical instruments had reinforced their unwillingness to attract trade via the employment of metal shutters. Meacher wondered what time it was. If the shops were closed, and the pub not yet open, he guessed it must be somewhere between 6 and 7 p.m. Looking up afforded him no clue, because the greyness between the rooftops more closely resembled a thick net stretched between the buildings than a portion of sky. He started to walk, though had no real idea in which direction the town centre lay. The silence was so unnerving that even the tiny crackle of grit beneath his soles made him wince. The narrow streets with their shuttered storefronts all looked the same, and after a while he began to wonder whether he was walking in circles. His mind still felt oddly inactive, as though unable to form thoughts of any substance. Every so often, he didn't so much stop to listen as stumble to a halt, as if he were a machine that periodically needed to conserve its energy to recharge. Unless his senses were as faulty as his memory, it seemed he was utterly alone. There was neither the distant rumble of traffic, nor even the faintest trill of birdsong. Perhaps it was Sunday, and everything was shut. The thought was less a comfort, and more an attempt to prevent his sense of disquiet escalating into fear. In truth, he knew that no town centre was ever this devoid of life. Something had happened here, probably while he'd been asleep on the train. The town had been abandoned or evacuated for some reason, and somehow he'd been overlooked. Blundering to yet another halt, he nervously sniffed the air. The only reason he could think of for such a wide-scale evacuation was the presence of some kind of severe physical threat. Was the place about to be bombed by terrorists? Or could the attack already be underway? Perhaps he was wandering around blithely inhaling toxic fumes. Perhaps germ warfare had come to Middle England and he was gulping down anthrax spores, or worse. Or perhaps, he thought, as he examined his skin and tried to convince himself that the nausea and breathlessness he was feeling were psychosomatic, the attack had already happened. Perhaps a nuclear bomb had been dropped close by, and the town's population had been evacuated to protect them from the approaching cloud of radioactive dust. There were flaws in his thinking. He knew that. But one thing was certain. He had to get to a phone, had to find out what was going on. He started to run, telling himself it was only stress that was making his lungs hurt and his legs feel leaden. But if so, what was it that was affecting his memory? He couldn't even remember getting on the train, never mind where he'd been going, or for what reason. As if his desperation for answers had made it happen, he suddenly emerged from the stultifying maze of drab streets full of shuttered buildings and found himself in a pedestrianised precinct, leading to what appeared to be a central square. There were comfortingly familiar chain stores here, Woolworth, Gap, HMV, though they seemed to be more impoverished versions of the ones he was used to seeing back home. Home. Where was that? The renewed surge of panic that accompanied his dawning realization that he knew almost nothing about himself was so overwhelming that he stumbled and almost fell as the strength drained out of him. He staggered up to a Miss Selfridge's and put an outspread palm on the display window to steady himself. His head was pounding, his body slick with sweat, and he was finding it difficult to breathe. His mind, however, was in overdrive. He thought of the air teeming with germs and chemicals, thought of toxins rushing through his body, disrupting it and destroying it. He expected to start coughing up blood at any moment, expected blisters to erupt on his skin. He waited for the first searing pain in his gut or head, and hoped that when it came, it would be intense enough to render him quickly unconscious. He'd rather pass out and die unknowing than writhe in agony as his innards dissolved into soup. He was heartened to discover, however, that several minutes later, rather than deteriorating, his condition had actually improved. He felt well enough, at least, to push himself away from the window and stand unaided. He even managed a wry grin. Panic attack, he thought. Not gas attack. Now pull yourself together, Meacher. It was at this point that he noticed all the mannequins in the clothes shop window had plastic bags over their heads. At first he thought it was some kind of avant-garde display. Thought the store was simply using shock tactics to grab attention. If so, he hoped it backfired on them. It was creepy, sick, and irresponsible. He almost welcomed his sense of indignation. For the first time since waking up on the train, he was responding emotionally to something that was not directly related to his own situation, and the respite, though brief, was welcoming. He looked around, almost as if hoping to spot someone in authority he could complain to, as if momentarily forgetting he was alone. His eyes swept across the rows of shops, of which several more, River Island, Envy, Benetton, used mannequins to display clothes they sold. And as he noticed each of them in turn, his indignation gave way to a mounting unease. There was not one mannequin he could see that did not have its face hidden in some way. Most had plastic bags over their heads, though in Envy, whoever they were, the staff presumably, had simply draped articles of clothing over the figures. The sight put Meacher in mind of parrots whose cages are covered to simulate night and encourage them to sleep. He couldn't for the life of him imagine what the motives of the staff might have been in this instance, unless the gesture was somehow symbolic, or even perhaps a form of black joke. Whatever the reason, the sight of all those smothered heads gave him the creeps. He shuddered and turned his gaze purposefully towards the central square. As he did so, noticing that it contained a statue of what appeared to be a figure on horseback, which he thought might give him an indication of where he was. He heard the first sound behind him that he hadn't made himself. It was an odd sound and brief, like someone liquidly clearing their throat or attempting to gargle with their own phlegm. It was also faint and muffled, as if he'd heard it inside a house from several rooms away. He whirled round. By the time he'd spun 90 degrees, all was quiet once more. Nevertheless, he hurried across to the door of River Island, which he'd pinpointed in his mind as the source of the sound, and yanked the handle. Finding the door locked, he peered through one of its reinforced glass panels to the store interior. The place was gloomy and apparently deserted. He was about to turn away when yet another mannequin caught his eye. This one was standing at the back of the shop, and like all the others, had a plastic bag draped over its head. In this case, however, not only did the bag appear to be clinging tightly to the mannequin's face, but there seemed to be an oval-shaped indentation in the plastic that to Meacher resembled a gaping mouth, desperate for air. Recoiling with a cry, Meacher turned away. There was a part of him that instantly wanted to go back, if only to reassure himself that what he'd seen had been nothing but a result of shadow play and his own imagination. However, his revulsion was too great, and propelled him towards the statue that dominated the central square. As he drew closer to it, he noticed two things, almost in unison. One was the presence of a quartet of telephone boxes, all perspex and cold grey steel, on the pavement outside a darkened cafe called Petra's Pantry. The other was what appeared to be a Hessian sack that had been pulled down over the statue's head. At least they left the horse alone, Meacher thought, and felt a sudden urge to giggle. He clapped a hand over his mouth and rushed towards the telephone boxes like a drunken man looking for somewhere to throw up. Wrenching open the door, almost pulled his arm out of its socket. He fell inside, snatched up the receiver and rammed it against his ear. The familiar hum of the dialing tone filled him with such joy that he did laugh out loud, and was immediately alarmed at how hysterical he sounded. The display screen informed him that there was a minimum call charge of 20 pence. Meacher shoved his left hand into his pocket and felt nothing but lining. Tilting his head to trap the phone between the shoulder and ear, he rooted through all his pockets, increasingly feverishly, with both hands. At some point during his snooze on the train, he must have been robbed, because his pockets were empty. Not only did he have no money, he had no wallet, no train tickets, not even a handkerchief. Had he once had a mobile phone? If so, it was gone now. He was on the verge of taking out his frustration by smashing the receiver against the smugly indifferent display screen, when he remembered that emergency calls were free. Unable to prevent the escape of a triumphant whoop that he found hard to equate to himself, he jabbed thrice at 9, and was only able to quell his eagerness to do it again by clenching a fist. A phone burred once, then was interrupted by a barely audible click. Meacher was framing his lips to say hello into the expectant pause that followed when the screaming began. It was a child's voice, shrill and bubbling with terror. Its words were running together to form a plea that it seemed would never end.
No, Daddy, please don't, Daddy, 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 no, Daddy, please don't, Daddy.
Meacher slammed the phone into its cradle, then slid as if boneless to the floor. He wrapped his arms around his head and began to keen. The child's voice had had a devastating effect on him, not only because it had been distressing to hear, but also because it had awakened what felt like a memory he couldn't grasp. He knew the child, he was sure of that, but he couldn't put a name or face to it. He clenched his hands into fists and began to pound the top of his head, punishing his brain for failing to yield its secrets. With each blow he grew angrier at himself and his situation, until rage reached such a peak that he scrambled to his feet, shoved open the door of the telephone box and charged, teeth bared, towards the hooded statue. The base of the statue was a rectangular block of stone, 6 feet high and inset with panels, each of which contained an elaborate carving of interweaving vines. Meacher threw himself at it, scraping a layer of skin off his arms as he hauled himself up beside the horse and its rider. The statue was slightly larger than life-size, the rider's covered head now 8 or 10 feet above him. As Meacher placed his left foot onto the horse's raised foreleg and grasped a loop of stone rein to heave himself closer to the sack, which he intended to tear from the rider's head as an act of manic defiance, he heard the rattling thump of a door opening on the opposite side of the square. Excited, fearful, and even a little abashed at the prospect of being discovered in such an uncompromising position, Meacher strained to see which of the many doors had opened and who had opened it. However, he hadn't raised himself quite high enough to lift his gaze above the horse's frozen mane, and so had to clamber down from his perch and peer between its motionlessly galloping legs, feeling not unlike a child engaged in a game of hide and seek. What he saw bewildered him for no more than a second before cold, harsh fear stabbed at the base of his throat, then cascaded through his body, lodging in his stomach like broken glass. On the far side of the square, the door of a pub, the Fleur-de-Lys, had opened, and 4 men had emerged from it. Dressed in jeans, shirts and boots, they looked perfectly normal, except for one thing. Like the mannequins in the clothes stores, and the stone rider atop its horse, each of them wore a sack-like hood over their head. The 2 thoughts that sped through Meacher's mind were more like sharp, bright flashes of despair than anything else. The first thought was an instinctive one that Meacher would have found curious had he had time to ponder it. He thought that if only he'd removed the sack from the statue's head and placed it over his own, he would have been safe. His second thought was perhaps equally intriguing, but more fundamental. He knew, with absolute conviction, that he had to get away before the men caught sight of him. Even as he jumped sprawlingly from the statue's plinth and tried to use its blocky mass to cover his retreat, he knew, he was already too late. The men didn't cry out, but even through their makeshift hoods it was obvious they were aware of his presence. They moved towards him with a purpose both remorseless and terrifying. And when he began to run, his terror making him feel as though he were wearing lead boots, their pursuit became more purposeful still. The subsequent chase through the unknown town's deserted streets was as surreally terrifying as any nightmare. Meech's terror made him stumble, stagger and skid. Within moments his body was greasy with sweat, which flowed from his hair and into his eyes, blinding him. His heart hammered, his lungs toiled. His breath felt like a length of barbed wire that he couldn't dislodge from his throat. Whenever he glanced back, his pursuers were the same distance behind him, which may have been encouraging if not for the fact that they appeared to be marching rather than running. Their movements effortless, machine-like, full of deadly intent. They were toying with him. Meacher knew. They were wearing him down prior to closing in for the kill. Meacher wished he could see their faces, and yet at the same time dreaded the disclosure of whatever might be concealed within those sackcloth hoods. In fact, in some ways, the prospect of finding out was what terrified him more than anything else. The streets were getting narrower, darker. Sooner or later he would come to a dead end, and that would be that. If he couldn't outrun his pursuers, he had to escape them in some other way. The only viable alternative was to evade them for long enough to find a hiding place. At best, that would be a short-term solution, but at least it would give him time to think, to plan his next move. He rounded a corner, his hand slapping the brick to steady himself as he changed direction, and, as though he'd willed it to appear, saw an aperture between two buildings on his right. So narrow it could barely even be termed an alleyway. He plunged down it, and was immediately doused in a gloom cold enough to make him feel as though he were underwater. Above him, the tops of the buildings on either side of the rat run appeared to be craning to touch one another. Certainly they gave the impression that they were squeezing the thin white stripe of sky that separated them still thinner. So dark did this make the alleyway, that from his present position, Meacher couldn't see its end. It was too late to change his mind, though. If he emerged from the alleyway now, his pursuers would be on him in an instant. He began to trot forward, stepping as lightly as he could in the hope that those behind him might plough straight past the slit-like entrance, oblivious. How much could they see through those hoods? How much could they hear? How much could they smell? This last thought came unbidden, and disturbed him the most. He thought of sniffer dogs attuned not to the scent of food or drugs, but to fear. He quickened his pace. Was the alleyway getting narrower still? If he stretched out both arms like a child pretending to fly, he reckoned he might just about be able to touch the buildings on either side. As he passed them, he barely glanced at the individual establishments embedded within the grey stone edifices. On a subconscious level, he registered that each of them was a cramped shop unit comprised of a door and a narrow display window with a sign above it. However, there wasn't one that wasn't coated in a layer of dust and grime so thick that it both obscured the name on the sign and made it impossible to tell what the shop sold, or once had. This, combined with a deepening murk that felt like Twilight's closing fist, made him fail to notice that one of the shop doors was ajar, until it creaked as it widened further. Meech's senses were so attuned to danger that his instinctive leftward spring was balletic. His landing, however, was not so graceful. His ankle turned on the pitted tarmac, and he all but shoulder-charged the door opposite the one that had opened. As he fought to regain his senses and his balance, he saw a grey-shrouded figure materialise from the gloom beyond the open door and extended a beckoning hand. The figure's face was concealed within a triangle of shadow, so black it seemed impenetrable. but his words were clear enough. "In here, quickly, if you don't want them to find you." Though Meacher hesitated, it still took him less than a second to make up his mind. The boom of his shoulder hitting the door was even now reverberating in the alleyway. In the otherwise total silence, his pursuers would have to be deaf not to have heard it. Scrambling upright, he propelled himself towards the figure, who backed away at his approach. Crossing the threshold felt like passing through a portal between this world and the next. The darkness into which Meacher plunged seemed so profound that for several seconds he was completely disorientated. Opening his eyes wide and finding nothing for his vision to latch onto, he flailed with his arms and was rewarded, or punished, by a crack of pain across his knuckles of his left hand. Undeterred, he groped again for the hard surface he'd encountered and found a thin ledge of some kind. Possibly a shelf or the edge of a desk. He clung to it, as a shipwrecked man might cling to driftwood, until his eyes had adapted to the sudden absence of light. It took perhaps a minute for the slowly emerging slatted shapes to gain sufficient definition to reveal themselves as books. As soon as they did, he acknowledged that the shop was full of them. Of course, he would have known sooner if he'd focused on any sense other than his eyesight, because as soon as he saw the books, he became aware of their musty odour. In any other circumstance, he would have found the smell comforting, even homely, though he'd hardly read a book since his childhood. Hearing a snick behind him, he whirled, but it was only the sound of the catch sliding into place as the shop door closed. So dingy was it, and so effectively did the shop owner blend into his surroundings, that the cowled man's movements from the door to the far side of the room seemed as soundless and insubstantial as a drift of smoke. "Thank you," Meacher said, his throat clogged by dust and exertion. But the man's only response was a sharp upraising of his left hand. Though it was hard to make out in the gloom, Meacher could tell by his stance that he was listening. As though deferring to a greater authority, Meacher too remained as still as he could, even though his exhausted body longed to sag. He did his utmost to contain his breath, despite the attempts his racing heart and toiling lungs were making to encourage him to pant and wheeze. The two of them stood there for so long that Meacher began to wonder whether the shop owner was once again waiting for him to speak. He was gathering the courage to do so when the man murmured, "Alas." Before Meacher could ask him what was wrong, a pounding on the door invalidated his question. Meacher instinctively scuttled forward, then ducked, twisting his head to look wildly behind him. Perhaps the most frightening aspect of the blows that seemed to be making the book shiver on the shelf was that they were not urgent, but ponderous, relentless, evenly spaced. They sounded more like the pounding of some vast machine piston than human fists on wood. They suggested to Meacher that his pursuers would never give up, that they would hunt him down remorselessly, that in their eyes, if they still had eyes beneath those hoods, the outcome of the chase was inevitable. Still cowering, he looked from the door to the shop owner in the same way that a small child would glance to a parent for guidance. "Go up the stairs," the man murmured, pointing to a shadowy patch of wall between two bookcases that, on closer inspection, Meacher realised was a door. "You will find an unlocked room there. Go inside and lock yourself in." "Will I be safe?" Meacher would have asked if fear had not denied him his voice, and if he'd not been so terrified of the answer. He blundered across the room, feeling as though the must and mould of ancient books was lining his lungs like silt, and scrabbled at the dark blot of a shadow that was the handle to the door that led upstairs. It opened smoothly, devoid of the creak he was expecting. He caught a glimpse of the stairs, little more than bands of differently hued shadow, before the door clicked shut behind him, taking the last vestige of light with it. Part of him welcomed the blackness. He wished he could curl up, close his eyes and lose himself in its folds. It was almost with reluctance that he forced himself on, edging forward until his toe end connected with the bottom stair. He began to climb, his body now incredibly weary, his joints grinding with glassy pain. He tried not to wonder where this would end, whether by some miracle he would escape the clutches of his pursuers, recover his memory and find his way home. Without knowing why, he'd become a fugitive, and the purpose of a fugitive was to run and to keep running until he either got away or was caught. Maybe his newfound ally would help him. Maybe when Meech's pursuers had gone, the two of them would sit down together and the shop owner would answer all his questions. Meech couldn't hear anything from downstairs. Couldn't even hear the pounding. Was the shop owner talking to his pursuers at the moment, or had they simply moved on? Had they knocked on the shop door not because they'd known he was inside, but because they were knocking on every door, hoping to either rouse and question the occupants, or simply to frighten him into bolting from wherever he might have chosen to hide? He knew he'd reached the upper landing, only when his raised right foot failed to encounter another stair. He settled it gently next to his left and used his arms as antennae to probe the way ahead. Encountering no resistance, he shuffled forward, the soles of his feet scraping along a surface that felt like rough, gritty wood. After a few steps, he moved to his right and within seconds encountered a wall of what seemed to be cold, uneven plaster. Feeling his way along, it only took him several seconds more to locate a door. His hand slithered over it until one of them found the knob, which was twisted in both directions several times before Meech concluded that it was locked. What was it that the shop owner had said? Go upstairs and into the unlocked room, something like that, which meant, presumably, that of several rooms up here, only one was unlocked. He simply had to find it, that was all. Simply had to be methodical. Rather than move across to the other side of the landing, he decided to feel his way to the next door on this side. Then there would be no chance of missing one. Blinking into the darkness and finding it unchanging, he probed the way cautiously forward with his feet, and almost immediately, his left palm caressing the wall, bumped against the jutting side of a second door frame. Even without his sight, his hand moved unerringly to the doorknob, and this time with barely a twist, the door opened. Meech stepped inside and quietly closed it behind him. Remembering what the shop owner had said about locking himself in, his searching fingers found a key, which rewarded him with a satisfying click when he twisted it clockwise. Turning to face the room, he realised it was not as dark as he'd first thought. The faint brownish illumination was provided by a meagre spill of light through a small window coated in grime and dust. Though the light was barely managing to establish itself, Meech could just make out a bed with rumpled bedclothes and a tall, blocky wardrobe. He did not notice the child, however, until it started whispering. His head twisted so sharply that a hot thread of pain flared in his neck. The child was standing so closely to the wall farthest away from the door that until he focused on it fully, it resembled nothing more as a particular fall of shadow on an uneven patch of plaster. Thinking that his fumblings at the door may have caused the child to scuttle across the room and press itself against the wall in fear, Meech moved closer to reassure it. more out of fear that it would give him away than because of a genuine urge to offer it comfort. However, he had taken no more than 4 steps towards it when he stopped. He had assumed the whispering to be a prayer, or an attempt by the child to find its voice, but now that he was close enough to hear it clearly, he realised it was neither. What the child was whispering were the words that it, or some other child in abject terror, had wailed at him from the phone in the square.
No, Daddy, please don't, Daddy, 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 no, Daddy, please don't, Daddy.
It was as though by repeating the words the child was giving them the power of an incantation. It was mocking or damning him with them. Micha felt anger, or more than anger, boiling inside him, and he took 2 further steps across the room. It was only at this point, some 6 or 8 feet from the child, that the scant light finally enabled him to make out particular details that had been denied him from further away. These details caused the strength to drain from his legs so abruptly that he thumped forward onto his knees. The child did not have its back to the wall at all. It was facing the wall, presenting its back almost insolently to him. Furthermore, like the mannequins, like its pursuers, like the statue in the square, it was wearing a bag over its head. It was the sight of the bag, black, plastic, wound round with masking tape, that triggered the memories in Micha's mind. Now, finally, he was beginning to realise why he was here. He held out his hands in supplication. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I am so sorry. Please, have mercy." Slowly, the child turned to face him.
No, Daddy, please don't, Daddy, no, Daddy, please don't, Daddy, no, Daddy, please don't, Daddy, no, Daddy, please don't, Daddy.
It whispered. As though relishing the moment, the child raised its hands, its fingertips resting on the black plastic, making it crackle. Then, still whispering, it hooked its fingers into the plastic and began to tear the bag from its face. This has been a Horror Book Blurb production, read and directed by Al Richardson. For more horror stories and horror book collecting content, please visit my YouTube channel, Horror Book Blurb.